The moment my son Daniel walked into my kitchen carrying a manila folder full of reverse mortgage paperwork, I knew exactly what he was planning. Not because I'm psychic, but because I've been watching him circle this $3 million farm like a hawk for 8 months, ever since his tech startup collapsed and left him drowning in debt. What Daniel didn't realize is that I'd been watching him watch me. He thought he was dealing with a simple 73-year-old widow who'd spent her whole life deferring to other people on financial matters. He assumed the woman who'd negotiated grain contracts worth $500,000 every harvest, managed 200 head of cattle through market crashes and droughts, and built this operation from a modest family farm into one of the most profitable spreads in 3 counties was somehow too naive to recognize a predator. He was about to discover exactly how wrong 70 years of underestimating farm women could make a person. But first, I was going to let him think he was winning. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, comment with your city and local time below. Because what happened next taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is let someone underestimate her intelligence while she plans their downfall. And it showed me that the quietest boundaries are often the strongest ones. Let me tell you how a son who thought he could manipulate his elderly mother out of her life's work learned what happens when you mistake quiet dignity for weakness, and how a farming community discovered that the most dangerous woman in any room is the one everyone assumes isn't paying attention. My name is Eleanor Margaret Walsh, and for 73 years, I've called this land home. What Daniel was eyeing like a prize was actually for generations of carefully built legacy. 160 acres of the richest soil in Iowa, plus everything my family had constructed on it over a century of patient work. The numbers that Daniel saw were simple. $3 million. What he didn't understand was how those numbers broke down, or why they mattered beyond his immediate financial crisis. The land itself, 160 acres of prime farmland, 5 miles outside Cedar Falls, was worth $14,000 an acre on today's market. That was $2.24 million right there. But this wasn't just empty acreage. My great-grandfather Patrick had cleared this land in 1923. And every generation since had added value that Daniel's startup-trained mind couldn't quantify. There was the original farmhouse Patrick built with his own hands, expanded twice and fully renovated in 1998. The dairy barn that my grandfather constructed in 1947, now converted to modern equipment storage, 3 grain silos, 2 equipment sheds, and a machine shop that my father built in the 60s when he started custom harvesting for neighboring farms. Most valuable of all was the infrastructure that wasn't visible from the road. The drainage tile system I'd installed in 1995 that increased yields by 30%. The soil conservation terraces that prevented erosion. The automated irrigation system that let us farm through droughts that bankrupted our neighbors. This wasn't just land. This was a precisely calibrated agricultural machine that produced reliable income year after year. Which Daniel knew, because he'd been asking very specific questions about our profit margins for months. "Mom, you're 73, he'd said just last week, perched at my kitchen table with his laptop open, calculating something. Don't you think it's time to enjoy life instead of working so hard?" What he meant was, don't you think it's time to liquidate this asset so I can solve my problems? Daniel had always been my pride. Brilliant boy, graduated from Iowa State with a computer science degree, moved to Des Moines and started his own company developing agricultural software. For 3 years, TechRow Solutions was the future apps to help farmers optimize planting schedules, track commodity prices, manage equipment maintenance. He'd raised $400,000 from investors, hired 6 employees, and talked about revolutionizing farming through technology. Right up until the company collapsed last March. I'd offered to help then. Not with the farm, I wasn't ready to retire, but with money. I had substantial savings from 50 years of profitable farming, enough to cover his debts and give him a fresh start. But Daniel was too proud for his mother's charity. Too proud, and too convinced that there was a bigger solution waiting if he could just find the right angle. That's when he started visiting more often. Started asking about my retirement plans. Started bringing his wife Ashley, who would wander through my house commenting on how much space it was for one person, how difficult the upkeep must be, how nice it would be to travel instead of worrying about cattle and corn prices. I let them talk. I nodded thoughtfully when they brought up retirement communities in Florida. I admitted that yes, the farm work was getting more challenging as I aged. I allowed them to believe that I was beginning to see their point. What I was actually doing was paying very close attention to the questions they weren't asking, and the assumptions they were making about what I did and didn't understand. Daniel assumed I didn't know that he'd called 3 different reverse mortgage companies in the past month. Ashley assumed I didn't notice her taking pictures of my antique furniture and asking casual questions about which pieces had been appraised recently. They both assumed that because I'd always handled the farming while my late husband Robert managed our investments and banking, I was somehow helpless with financial complexities. They had no idea that I'd been managing our farm's finances for the last 15 years of Robert's life. After his stroke made detailed analytical work difficult for him, they didn't know that I could read a financial statement as easily as I could read weather patterns, or that I'd been researching reverse mortgages for weeks, not because I wanted one, but because I wanted to understand exactly what Daniel was planning. Because here's what 73 years had taught me about boundaries. The most dangerous people in your life are often the ones who love you just enough to rationalize taking what they need from you. And the most effective way to handle those people isn't to confront them directly. It's to let them reveal exactly who they are, while you document everything. If you've ever had to set quiet boundaries with someone who thought they could manipulate you, share your city and how you handled it. Sometimes the strongest response is the one they never see coming. Daniel arrived that Tuesday morning with his manila folder and a confidence that should have been my first warning. But I'd been expecting this conversation for weeks, and I was ready. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation last month," he said, settling into the chair across from my kitchen table. "About your retirement plans." I poured him coffee from the pot I'd made fresh, added the cream he liked, and sat down with my own cup. "Oh, I think I've found the perfect solution for your financial security." He opened the folder, revealing glossy brochures and official-looking documents. "It's called a reverse mortgage, and it's specifically designed for people in your situation." My situation. I let that phrase hang in the air while I sipped my coffee. "I've never heard of that," I said, which was true. Before 2 weeks ago, when I'd started researching them after overhearing Daniel's phone calls. "It's brilliant, really." Daniel's voice took on the enthusiastic tone he'd used when explaining his startup to investors. "You get to stay in your house for the rest of your life, but you can access the equity you've built up. Think of it as the bank paying you instead of you paying the bank." I leaned forward, letting curiosity show on my face. "How does that work?" "Well, instead of making mortgage payments, the bank pays you a lump sum based on the value of your property. You keep living here, you don't have to worry about payments, and you have financial security for the rest of your life." What Daniel didn't mention was that in a reverse mortgage, the debt grows every month, compounding interest and fees until the total owed often exceeds the home's value. He didn't explain that when I died, the bank would claim the property to recover their loan, and he certainly didn't mention that the borrower can name a beneficiary who would receive any remaining equity after the loan is repaid. But I already knew all of that. What I was interested in learning was what Daniel planned to do with that beneficiary designation. It sounds complicated, I said, frowning at the documents. Are you sure this is a good idea? Mom, with this place worth $3 million, you could get a substantial payout. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life without worrying about farm income or equipment repairs or bad weather affecting your cash flow. There it was. Daniel had done his homework on my property value. He knew exactly what this farm was worth, and he was positioning the reverse mortgage as financial liberation rather than what it actually was. Liquidation of my life's work. I don't know, honey. This farm has been in our family for 4 generations, and it will stay in the family. Daniel's voice carried just a hint of impatience. The beneficiary arrangement means that eventually, any remaining equity would go to me and Ashley. So you're not really losing the farm, you're just accessing its value while you're alive to enjoy it. Remaining equity. In a reverse mortgage where the loan balance grew every month while property values stayed relatively stable, there would be no remaining equity. Daniel knew this. He was counting on it. But what he didn't know was that my phone, sitting innocuously beside my coffee cup, was recording every word. By Thursday, Daniel had returned with Ashley and a new strategy: emotional manipulation disguised as family concern. Eleanor, Ashley said, using the formal version of my name she always employed when she wanted something. Daniel and I have been talking, and we're really worried about you living out here all alone. Ashley was a small, sharp woman who worked in marketing for a processing company in Des Moines. She had a talent for making self-serving suggestions sound like altruistic concern, and she'd been practicing that skill on me for months. What if something happens to you? She continued. What if you fall, or have a medical emergency? By the time someone found you, I let my expression show worry. I hadn't really thought about that. Plus, you're working so hard at an age when you should be relaxing. Daniel picked up the thread smoothly. Ashley and I were thinking with the reverse mortgage, you could maybe move somewhere closer to town. Somewhere with people around, medical facilities nearby. But this is my home, I protested, with exactly the right amount of uncertainty in my voice. Of course it is, Ashley said soothingly. But home is about the people you love, not the building you live in. And we love you so much that we want you to be safe and comfortable. What Ashley meant was that she wanted me out of the house, so that when the reverse mortgage eventually led to foreclosure, there would be no messy scenes about displaced elderly farmers. Much cleaner to have me already relocated somewhere else. Have you thought about what would happen to the farm operations? I asked. The cattle, the grain contracts, the equipment. Daniel and Ashley exchanged a look that lasted just a fraction too long. Well, Daniel said carefully, if you're not actively farming anymore, it might make sense to simplify things. Maybe lease the land to neighboring farmers, sell the equipment. Sell the equipment. I let my voice rise slightly. Daniel, that machinery is worth over $400,000. Exactly. Ashley jumped in. That's $400,000 that's just sitting there depreciating, when it could be working for you in investments. They had calculated this. They had researched not just the reverse mortgage process, but the liquidation value of everything I owned. This wasn't a spontaneous suggestion born from concern for my welfare. This was a systematic plan to convert my entire operation into cash. Cash that would flow through the reverse mortgage into their hands as beneficiaries, while I lived on whatever monthly payments the mortgage company decided to provide. I need time to think about all this, I said, standing up from the table. It's a lot to process. Of course, Daniel said. Take all the time you need, but Mom, don't wait too long. These financial products are designed for people in your exact situation, and the sooner you start, the more you'll benefit. After they left, I sat in my kitchen reviewing the conversation. My phone had captured everything, including Ashley's comment about the equipment values and Daniel's carefully worded suggestion about liquidating the farm operations. They were planning to dismantle my life's work piece by piece, convert it to cash, and leave me dependent on their generosity for my final years. All while convincing themselves and trying to convince me that they were acting in my best interests. The following Monday brought Daniel alone, carrying a different folder and wearing an expression I recognized from his childhood. The look he got when he was about to push a boundary he wasn't sure he could cross. "Mom, I've been talking to the reverse mortgage people, and they're willing to come out for a consultation. No obligation, just an explanation of how everything would work." I was washing dishes at the kitchen sink, my back to him, but I could hear the tension in his voice. "When?" I asked. "This afternoon, if that works. I know it's short notice, but they had a cancellation, and I thought it might be good to get the information while you're thinking about it." I turned around, drying my hands on a dish towel. "This afternoon, Daniel, that does seem rushed." I know. "But Mom, the thing is..." He paused, and for a moment I saw a flash of the desperate man behind the careful manipulation. "I'm in some financial trouble. The startup left me with more debt than I initially realized, and Ashley and I are struggling to keep up with everything." There it was. The first honest thing he'd said in months. "How much trouble?" I asked gently. $200,000. Credit cards, business loans, personal guarantees I signed when I thought the company would succeed. His voice was flat, defeated. "If I can't figure something out soon, we might lose our house." This was the moment where a normal mother might have offered to help, where a healthy family relationship would have led to a conversation about loans or gifts, or bankruptcy alternatives. But Daniel wasn't asking for help, he was explaining why he needed to take what I had. "Oh, honey," I said, letting concern fill my voice. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't want to burden you, and because I thought I could handle it myself." He looked up at me, and I saw a mixture of shame and calculation in his expression. "But the reverse mortgage could solve both our problems. You get financial security, and as the beneficiary, I get a path out of this debt." As the beneficiary, he was admitting that my death was part of his financial planning. "I don't understand how my reverse mortgage helps with your debt," I said, though of course I understood perfectly. "Well, the lump sum payment would be substantial, and if something happened to you, which hopefully won't be for many years, but if it did, the beneficiary provisions would clear everything up." He was asking me to sign documents that would make my death financially beneficial to him while solving his immediate cash flow problems through a loan secured by my property. And he was framing this as a favor to both of us. "Daniel," I said slowly, "are you asking me to mortgage my farm to pay your debts?" "No." His response was quick, almost panicked. "No, Mom, that's not what this is. The reverse mortgage is for your benefit. The fact that it also helps me is just a side effect." A side effect. My son had just described my death as a side effect of his financial planning. But what Daniel didn't know was that every word of this conversation was being recorded by the phone sitting in my back pocket, or that I'd already consulted with an elder law attorney about exactly this scenario. Or that I'd spent the weekend calling every neighbor within 5 miles to let them know that someone might be coming around asking questions about my mental state or my ability to manage my affairs. Daniel thought he was manipulating a lonely old woman into a financial arrangement she didn't understand. What he was actually doing was confessing to attempted elder financial abuse, while I built a comprehensive legal case against him. The consultation was scheduled for 3 o'clock. I told Daniel I'd be ready, and I meant it. But I was going to be ready for something entirely different than what he was expecting. If you've ever had someone try to convince you that their benefit was actually yours, comment below with what red flags you recognized. Understanding manipulation tactics helps all of us set better boundaries. At exactly 3 o'clock, a silver sedan pulled into my driveway carrying Daniel and 2 people I'd never met, but felt like I knew intimately. After 2 weeks of research, I could have written their script myself. The woman was Margaret Foster from Heartland Reverse Mortgages. Mid-40s, with carefully styled hair and a portfolio that had seen this presentation hundreds of times. The man was Tony Hernandez, described as a financial counselor whose job was to make elderly clients feel comfortable while they signed away their financial futures. I met them at the door wearing my best confused but trying expression. The one I'd perfected during my late husband's business meetings when I wanted people to underestimate how much I understood. "Mrs. Walsh," Margaret said, extending a manicured hand. "Thank you so much for taking the time to learn about how a reverse mortgage could benefit you." I invited them to my dining room table, where I'd set out coffee and store-bought cookies, a touch that I knew would reinforce their assumptions about a simple farm woman who didn't quite grasp complex financial instruments. "Now, Mrs. Walsh," Margaret began, opening a folder identical to the one Daniel had brought. "Your son has explained a little about your situation. You're living alone on a large property, and you're interested in accessing some of the equity you've built up over the years." "I'm not sure I understand what that means," I said, looking confused. Which was perfectly honest. I didn't understand how they planned to present theft as a service. "Of course, let me explain it in simple terms." Margaret's voice took on the patronizing tone reserved for children and elderly people. "You've lived in this house for many years, paying off your mortgage and improving the property. All of that work has created equity. Think of it as the difference between what your house is worth and what you owe on it." She paused, waiting for me to nod understanding. I obliged. "Now, with the traditional mortgage, you pay the bank every month. With a reverse mortgage, the bank pays you. You get to stay in your home for the rest of your life, but you also get a cash payment based on your home's value." "How much cash?" I asked, leaning forward with the eagerness of someone who'd never managed substantial money. Tony jumped in, consulting his tablet. "Based on our preliminary assessment, your property appears to be worth approximately $3 million. With your age and the loan-to-value ratios we typically offer, you could be looking at an initial payout of somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000. I let my eyes widen. That much, Margaret confirmed. "And the beauty of it is, you don't have to pay anything back, as long as you live in the home. The loan balance grows over time, but that's a problem for tomorrow, not today. A problem for tomorrow." That was one way to describe the fact that the loan would eventually consume the entire value of my property, leaving nothing for any heirs except the debt. "But what happens when I die?" I asked, playing the role of someone just beginning to think through the implications. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was the moment where most people began to understand what they were really signing. "Well," Margaret said smoothly, "when that time comes, hopefully, many, many years from now, the loan becomes due. Typically, the property is sold to pay off the loan balance, and any remaining equity goes to your heirs." Any remaining equity, in a loan designed to consume all equity over time. This was a mathematical impossibility that Margaret was presenting as a likely outcome. "But what if the loan balance is more than the house is worth when I die?" "That's an excellent question," Tony said. And I could tell from his tone that this was where people usually started backing out. Federal regulations limit the amount owed to the value of the home at the time of sale. So your heirs would never owe more than the house is worth. Which meant that in the scenario they were describing, my heirs would inherit nothing except the obligation to surrender the property. I don't understand, I said, letting frustration creep into my voice. If the loan balance grows every month, and I'm not making payments, how would there be anything left for my family? Margaret and Tony exchanged the briefest glance, the look of professionals, dealing with a client who was asking inconvenient questions. Mrs. Walsh, Margaret said, property values generally increase over time. So while the loan balance is growing, your home's value is likely growing as well. In many cases, appreciation more than offsets the loan growth. This was the moment when I realized that Margaret Foster was either genuinely incompetent or deliberately lying. Property appreciation of 3 to 5% annually could never keep pace with a reverse mortgage that compounded interest and fees at 8 to 12%. She was presenting a mathematical impossibility as a reasonable expectation. But Daniel was nodding along, encouraging me to believe that this financial fantasy could somehow benefit everyone involved. What about the farm operations? I asked. I still have cattle and grain contracts and equipment leases. Oh, you can absolutely continue farming, Tony assured me. The reverse mortgage doesn't affect your ability to use the property as you always have. Another lie. The moment I signed the documents, the bank would become the primary stakeholder in my property. Any significant changes to the land use, any damage to the buildings, any failure to maintain insurance or pay property taxes would trigger default clauses that could accelerate the entire loan. I was being asked to sign a document that would gradually transfer ownership of my farm to a bank, while maintaining the illusion that I was still in control. This all sounds very complicated, I said, sitting back in my chair. Maybe I should have a lawyer look at the paperwork before I sign anything. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Of course you can consult with an attorney, Margaret said quickly. But I should mention that many lawyers aren't familiar with reverse mortgages, and sometimes they raise concerns that aren't really relevant to your specific situation. Daniel leaned forward. Mom, remember what we talked about? You don't want to overcomplicate this. Margaret and Tony are experts. They do this every day. What Daniel meant was, don't involve anyone who might explain what you're actually signing. I understand your hesitation, Tony said, pulling out a different set of forms. What if we start with something simpler? This is just a preliminary application that would give us more detailed information about your financial situation. It doesn't commit you to anything, but it would let us provide more specific numbers for your consideration. I looked at the forms. They were requesting my social security number, bank account information, property tax records, and authorization to access my credit report. Everything a criminal would need to monitor my finances and track my assets. I'm sorry, I said, standing up. This is all happening too fast for me. I need time to think. Margaret's professional smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, Mrs. Walsh, but I should let you know that interest rates and loan terms change frequently. The offer we can make today might not be available next month. Classic high-pressure sales tactics. Create artificial urgency to prevent careful consideration. Daniel walked them to their car while I cleared the coffee cups, listening to their muffled conversation through the kitchen window. When he came back inside, his expression was a mixture of frustration and barely controlled desperation. Mom, what are you afraid of? These people are trying to help you. I'm not afraid, honey. I'm just careful. 73 years of life has taught me that when something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. This isn't too good to be true. It's a legitimate financial product used by thousands of seniors every year. And how many of those seniors' children needed them to die quickly to solve their debt problems? The words hung in the air between us like a blade. Daniel's face went white, then red. "That's not what this is about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it, Daniel? You told me yourself that you're $200,000 in debt. You explained that the reverse mortgage would make you the beneficiary of this property. You've calculated the value of my equipment and suggested I sell it. You've talked about liquidating 50 years of my work to solve problems that you created. Mom, I'm trying to help both of us." "No, honey, you're trying to help yourself, and you're asking me to pretend that your benefit is the same as mine." Daniel stood in my kitchen, trapped between his desperation and his remaining conscience, and I saw the exact moment when desperation won. "Fine," he said. "You're right. I need this. I need help, and this is the only way I can see to get it. But Mom, you don't need this farm anymore. You're 73 years old. How many more years do you really think you can keep working like this?" And there it was. My son telling me that my remaining years weren't worth preserving my life's work. That his financial crisis was more important than my financial security. That my death would be inconvenient for him if it came before I'd signed the papers that would transfer my wealth to him. "Get out," I said quietly. "Mom, get out of my house, Daniel, and don't come back until you're ready to have an honest conversation about what you're really asking me to do." After he left, I sat at my kitchen table and reviewed the conversation I'd just recorded. 3 hours of systematic lies, pressure tactics, and emotional manipulation, all captured in perfect digital clarity. But more importantly, I'd gotten Daniel to admit his real motivation. He'd confessed that he needed my property to solve his debt problems, and he'd suggested that my age made my continued ownership of the farm questionable. It was exactly the kind of evidence that elder abuse investigators would find very interesting. Share your thoughts below if you've ever had someone tell you that their needs should matter more than your boundaries. Sometimes recognizing manipulation is the first step to stopping it. The morning after I sent Daniel away, my phone started ringing. Not with apologies or second chances, but with something that told me exactly who my son had been talking to while I thought I was playing him. "Eleanor. This is Janet Morrison from First National Bank." Janet had been handling my farm loans for 15 years. Her voice carried an unfamiliar tension. "I'm calling about some inquiries we've received regarding your accounts." I settled into my kitchen chair, coffee cup in hand. "What kind of inquiries?" "Someone claiming to be your financial power of attorney called yesterday asking about your account balances and loan history. When we explained that we had no record of you granting anyone financial power of attorney, they suggested that you might be experiencing some cognitive difficulties." The coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. "They said what?" "Eleanor, I want you to know that we didn't provide any information, but I'm required to document these types of concerns, and I wanted you to be aware that someone is making these claims." Daniel hadn't accepted my refusal. He'd moved to phase 2, establishing a narrative that I was mentally incompetent to make my own financial decisions. "Janet, I need you to do something for me. I need you to place a fraud alert on all my accounts. No information to anyone, regardless of their claimed relationship to me, without my direct authorization." "Of course. Eleanor, are you all right? Is someone pressuring you?" Janet Morrison had watched me manage complicated farm finances through market crashes, droughts, and equipment failures. She'd seen me negotiate grain contracts and equipment loans with the sharp precision of someone who understood that a single decimal point could mean the difference between profit and loss. If anyone could testify to my mental competence, it was the banker who'd been working with me for a decade and a half. "I'm fine, Janet. but I think someone is trying very hard to convince people that I'm not. After I hung up, I walked to my kitchen window and looked out across the fields that Daniel wanted to liquidate. The corn was coming along beautifully. We'd have a good harvest if the weather held. The cattle were fat and healthy in the south pasture. Equipment was serviced and ready for fall work. This was a working farm in peak condition, managed by someone with 5 decades of experience and a sharp understanding of both agricultural and financial markets, none of which mattered if Daniel could convince enough people that I was no longer competent to make my own decisions. My second call came an hour later, from Dr. Patricia Chen, my physician for the past 20 years. Eleanor, I had the strangest conversation yesterday. Your son called asking about scheduling a cognitive evaluation for you. He seemed to think there might be some concerns about memory or decision-making abilities. And what did you tell him? I told him that any medical concerns would need to come from you directly, and that based on our last visit 3 months ago, I had no reason to think you were experiencing any cognitive issues. But, Eleanor, I'm wondering if there's something going on that I should know about. Dr. Chen had been monitoring my health through the usual challenges of aging, some arthritis, blood pressure medication, the standard adjustments that come with being 73. But my last cognitive assessment, done as part of my annual physical, had shown me to be sharp, alert, and fully competent. Patricia, if someone were trying to have me declared mentally incompetent, what would they need to prove it? There was a long pause. Eleanor, is someone actually trying to do that? I think so. And I need to understand what I'm dealing with. They would need medical evidence. Multiple evaluations showing cognitive decline, inability to manage daily activities, impaired judgment about financial or personal matters. It's not easy to have someone declared incompetent. The courts require substantial proof, and if someone were documenting supposed evidence of my incompetence, spreading stories about confusion or poor decision-making, that would be concerning. Eleanor, if you're dealing with elder abuse, there are resources. I'm not being abused, Patricia. I'm being underestimated. But I need people who can testify to my competence if this goes where I think it's going. My third call came from Martha Henderson, whose farm bordered mine to the east. Martha was 78, had been farming longer than I had, and possessed the kind of direct honesty that made her the unofficial leader of our small rural community. Eleanor, I don't know what your boy thinks he's doing, but he came by yesterday asking the strangest questions. I felt my stomach tighten. What kind of questions? Whether I'd noticed you seeming confused lately. Whether you'd been making poor decisions about the farm. Whether I thought you might need help managing your affairs. Martha's voice carried the outrage of someone who'd never tolerated nonsense in 8 decades of life. I told him that you're the sharpest farmer in 3 counties, and if he thought otherwise, he obviously didn't know his own mother very well. What did he say to that? He got that look men get when a woman doesn't agree with them. Started talking about how much he worried about you living alone. How the farm was too much responsibility for someone your age. How maybe it was time for professional assistance with your finances. Daniel was conducting a systematic campaign to establish my incompetence. Bank calls to suggest financial confusion. Doctor calls to request cognitive evaluations. Neighbor visits to document supposed evidence of declining judgment. But Daniel had made a crucial miscalculation. He assumed that rural communities were collections of isolated individuals who wouldn't communicate with each other. He didn't understand that farmers talk about weather, about crops, about equipment, and especially about anything unusual happening in their neighborhood. What I didn't realize was how slowly that communication would develop. Rural folks are careful about family business, respectful of privacy, and hesitant to get involved in other people's problems. Martha didn't immediately call everyone else. Instead, she waited to see if other strange things would happen. Over the following 2 weeks, my phone rang with increasing frequency, but it wasn't the immediate groundswell I'd hoped for. It was more like watching storm clouds gather. You could see something building, but it took time to develop. Eleanor, this is Tom Rodriguez from down on Highway 6. Your boy came by yesterday with the damnedest questions about whether you'd been maintaining your fences properly. Tom had waited 3 days after Daniel's visit to call me, spending that time thinking about whether he should get involved. 2 days later, Eleanor, it's Susan Wright. Daniel stopped by asking if I'd noticed you driving erratically or seeming confused at the grain elevator. Susan had discussed Daniel's visit with her husband for a week before deciding to reach out. A week after that, Eleanor, Jim Patterson here. That son of yours wanted to know if you'd been falling behind on your fieldwork or making odd decisions about your cattle. Jim had actually called Martha first to ask if other neighbors had received similar visits before calling me. Each call added another piece to the picture. But the pieces came together slowly, the way rural communities actually work. People talked to their spouses first, then their closest neighbors, then gradually expanding circles of trust. It wasn't immediate solidarity, it was careful, methodical community analysis. Daniel wasn't just trying to establish my incompetence, he was trying to document specific evidence that could be used in a legal proceeding. Questions about farm management, driving ability, financial decisions, and property maintenance. All the areas that a court would examine when determining someone's capacity to live independently. But what Daniel didn't realize was that every neighbor he contacted had known me for decades. They'd watched me farm through droughts and floods, navigate commodity market crashes, and manage the complex logistics of a modern agricultural operation. They'd seen me negotiate with banks, implement new technologies, and make the thousands of small decisions that determine whether a farm succeeds or fails. More importantly, they recognized a coordinated attack when they saw one, even if it took them a few weeks to connect all the dots. It was Martha who finally called the meeting, 3 weeks after Daniel's first neighbor visit. Eleanor, she said, settling into my kitchen table on a Friday morning, carrying a coffee cake, and wearing the expression she got when someone had seriously underestimated her intelligence. We need to talk about what your boy is trying to do to you. I poured coffee and waited. Tom, Susan, Jim, the Kowalskis, the Andersons, even old Frank Muller. Daniel has contacted every farmer within 10 miles, asking questions about your competence. It took us a while to piece it all together, because we don't usually gossip about family business. But when the same questions start coming up in different conversations, people notice. Martha had been the unofficial coordinator of our farming community for as long as I could remember. When someone needed help with harvest, when a family faced medical bills they couldn't handle, when equipment broke down and neighbors needed to pool resources, Martha was the one who organized the response. What are you thinking? I asked. I'm thinking that boy is building a case to have you declared incompetent so he can get control of your property. And I'm thinking we need to make sure he doesn't succeed. Martha smiled, and it wasn't a gentle expression. Honey, an attack on one farmer is an attack on all of us. If Daniel can convince a court that a woman with your skills and experience is incompetent to manage her own affairs, then none of us are safe from our own greedy relatives. She opened her purse and pulled out a legal pad covered with her neat handwriting. I've been documenting every conversation, every question Daniel asked, every person he contacted. Tom's been doing the same thing. We've got dates, times, and witnesses. If this goes to court, Daniel is going to discover that his evidence-gathering campaign created a lot more evidence than he planned on. I looked at Martha's notes, seeing my community's response to Daniel's manipulation. These were people who'd known me for decades, who'd worked alongside me through every challenge that farming could present. They'd watched me make complex decisions under pressure, manage substantial sums of money, and maintain standards of operation that had kept my farm profitable while others failed. But it had taken them weeks to organize this response, because that's how rural communities actually work. Not through immediate action, but through careful consideration, gradual communication, and eventual collective decision-making. There's something else, Martha said. Frank Muller's daughter is a lawyer in Cedar Falls, elder law, specifically. When Frank told her what was happening, she said she'd be willing to consult with you about protective measures. What kind of protective measures? Documentation of your competence. Legal safeguards against fraudulent power of attorney claims. Maybe a formal cognitive evaluation by a court-approved specialist, just to have it on record. Martha leaned forward. Eleanor, if someone is trying to prove you're incompetent, sometimes the best defense is to prove very thoroughly that you're not. I thought about the recordings on my phone. The documented lies about reverse mortgages, the admission of Daniel's financial motivation, the systematic campaign to discredit my judgment. Evidence that showed not just what Daniel was trying to do, but why he was trying to do it. Martha, I said, I think it's time to let people know that I've been paying attention to more than just the farming. That afternoon, I called Daniel. Mom. His voice carried relief and hope. I was hoping you'd call. I know things got heated the other day, but I really think we can work this out. I'm sure we can, honey. In fact, I've been thinking about what you said, and I'd like to hear more about the reverse mortgage. Would you mind coming by tomorrow? Maybe you could bring Ashley, and we could all discuss it together. Of course. That's great, Mom. I'll bring the paperwork, and we can go through everything step by step. That sounds perfect. Oh, and Daniel. Would it be all right if I invited a few neighbors to join us? You know how rural folks like to understand these financial products? I thought Martha Henderson might be interested, and maybe Tom Rodriguez and the Kowalskis. There was a pause. You want the neighbors to be there? Well, you've been talking to them about my situation anyway. I thought it might be nice to have everyone together, so we can all understand how this reverse mortgage thing works. Another pause, longer this time. Mom, this is really a family discussion. Of course it is, honey, but since you've been asking the neighbors about my competence to make financial decisions, I thought they might like to see me making one. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. I'll see you tomorrow, Mom, Daniel finally said. Let's keep it simple, okay? After I hung up, I called Martha. How quickly can you get the word out that we're having a community meeting tomorrow afternoon about reverse mortgages and elder financial protection? How quickly do you need it? By noon tomorrow, consider it done. Eleanor, what are you planning? I'm planning to show my son exactly what happens when you underestimate a farm woman who's been paying attention. Saturday afternoon arrived with unseasonably perfect weather and a dining room full of people Daniel hadn't expected to see. When he and Ashley pulled into my driveway at 2 o'clock, they found trucks and cars belonging to every significant farmer within 10 miles of my property. Through the window, I watched Daniel sit in his car for a full minute, clearly trying to decide whether to drive away or proceed with whatever strategy he'd prepared for a private family manipulation session. He chose to proceed. That was his second mistake of the day. His first had been underestimating exactly how much I'd learned about him over the past month. Mom, Daniel said as he and Ashley entered my dining room. His voice carefully controlled, despite the surprise of finding Martha Henderson, Tom Rodriguez, the Kowalski brothers, Susan Wright, and 6 other neighbors seated around my expanded table. I thought we were going to have a family discussion. We are having a family discussion, I replied, gesturing to the assembled group. This is my family. These are the people who've known me, worked with me, and supported me for decades. I thought they should hear about this reverse mortgage opportunity you've been so excited about. Ashley's face had gone pale. She understood the implications faster than Daniel did. Mrs. Walsh, Martha said in her clear, carrying voice, Daniel has been telling all of us about his concerns regarding your mental capacity. We're very interested to hear his explanation of how these financial products work. Actually, Tom Rodriguez added, we're especially interested in hearing how a reverse mortgage benefits someone your age and in your situation. Daniel looked around the room, seeing faces that had known him since childhood but were now regarding him with open skepticism. These weren't urban strangers who might be impressed by his technological background and financial sophistication. These were people who measured competence by results, honesty by consistency, and worth by character. Well, Daniel began, settling into his chair with visible reluctance. The reverse mortgage is designed to help seniors access the equity in their homes while continuing to live there. How much equity? Asked Frank Mueller, whose daughter had spent the previous evening coaching him on relevant questions. Based on the property value, probably somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 initially. Initially, Susan Wright leaned forward. What happens after initially? I watched Daniel realize that he was facing people who understood that every financial instrument had costs, risks, and long-term implications. He couldn't rely on their ignorance or their deference to his expertise. Well, the loan balance grows over time. Interest and fees are added monthly. But the idea is that property appreciation offsets the loan growth. At what rate does the loan balance grow? Martha asked. It varies. Market rates plus fees and insurance. Probably 8 to 12% annually. And what rate does farmland appreciate in this area? Tom asked. Daniel hesitated. Everyone in the room knew the answer to that question. Historically, about 3 to 5%, he admitted. So the loan grows faster than the property value, Frank stated. Which means that over time, the amount owed exceeds the value of the property. Not necessarily, Daniel. Martha's voice cut through his beginning protest. We're farmers. We understand math. If money grows at 8 to 12% and property grows at 3 to 5%, the money grows faster, which means that eventually, there's no equity left. But Mom would have the cash from the initial payment. How long would $400,000 last? Susan asked. If your mother needed long-term care, if she had medical expenses, if she lived another 20 years. I watched my son realize that he was trying to sell a financially sophisticated audience, a product that didn't make mathematical sense. Worse, he was trying to sell it while they knew his real motivation. Daniel, I said gently, why don't you explain to everyone how the beneficiary provisions work? Ashley shot me a sharp look. She'd recognized the trap even if Daniel hadn't. The beneficiary provisions are standard, Daniel said carefully. When the borrower dies, any remaining equity goes to the designated beneficiary. And who would be the beneficiary in your mother's case? Martha asked. Well, I would be. I see. And given that the loan balance grows faster than property values, how much equity do you expect would remain when your mother dies? Daniel didn't answer. Daniel, I continued, perhaps you could also explain to everyone why you've been calling them to ask about my mental competence. The room went completely silent. I haven't been. You contacted Martha asking if I seemed confused. You called Tom asking if I'd been making poor farming decisions. You asked Susan if I'd been driving erratically. I kept my voice calm, factual. You called my bank asking about my financial status. You called my doctor requesting cognitive evaluations. Would you like to explain to everyone why you did that?" Daniel's face had gone from pale to red. "Mom, I was concerned about you. Living alone, managing everything by yourself. Were you concerned about me? Or were you concerned about establishing evidence that I'm not competent to make my own financial decisions?" Ashley stood up abruptly. "We should go," she said to Daniel. "Not yet," Martha said firmly. "Daniel, I think there are some things you need to understand about your mother." She pulled out a folder that I recognized as the one she'd shown me the day before. "Your mother has been managing this farm profitably for 50 years. Last year, she negotiated grain contracts worth $700,000. She manages a cattle operation that generated $200,000 in profit. She maintains equipment worth $500,000. She has never missed a loan payment, never defaulted on a contract, and never made a financial decision that wasn't carefully researched and mathematically sound." Martha looked around the room, making eye contact with each neighbor. "More than that, your mother saw what you were trying to do to her from the very beginning. While you thought you were manipulating a confused old woman, she was documenting every lie you told, every pressure tactic you used, and every attempt you made to undermine her reputation in this community." I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. "Daniel, would you like to hear the recording of our conversation last Monday? The one where you admitted that you need my death to be financially beneficial to you?" The blood drained from Daniel's face completely. "Mom, you were recording me. I was protecting myself from someone who claimed to love me, while systematically planning to steal everything I've worked for." I looked around the room at my neighbors, people who'd known me for decades, who'd watched me make good decisions under pressure, who understood the difference between helping someone and exploiting them. "Everyone here knows what elder financial abuse looks like," I continued. "And everyone here has seen you attempt it. The question now is what we do about it." Frank Mueller spoke up. "Eleanor, my daughter says that what Daniel has done constitutes attempted fraud, elder abuse, and possibly conspiracy if he was working with that reverse mortgage company to target you specifically. She also says," Martha added, "that his attempts to discredit your mental competence could be considered defamation and harassment." Daniel was looking frantically around the room, searching for a friendly face or an escape route. "This is family business," Ashley said, her voice sharp with panic. "These people have no right to interfere." "These people," I said, "are the ones you tried to use as witnesses against me. When you asked them to confirm that I was losing my mental faculties, you made them part of this situation. And when they refused to lie for you, you made them your adversaries." Tom Rodriguez leaned forward. "Daniel, your mother is one of the most competent people in this county. The fact that you thought you could convince us otherwise tells us a lot about how little you understand her, and how little you understand this community." "What do you want from me?" Daniel asked, and for the first time, his voice carried genuine defeat. "I want you to understand what you tried to do," I said. "You tried to convince me that losing my independence would benefit me. You tried to convince my community that I was losing my mental faculties. You tried to use my love for you as a weapon against my own interests. And you did all of that because you made poor financial decisions and decided that your problems were more important than my rights." I stood up, looking down at my son. "You will not contact my bank again. You will not call my doctor again. You will not visit my neighbors asking questions about my competence. You will not bring reverse mortgage salespeople to my home. And you will not treat my death as a solution to your financial problems." "Mom, I'm not finished. You have 30 days to find a real solution to your debt problems. Not a solution that depends on my property or my death, but a solution that you create yourself. If you can do that, if you can prove that you're capable of managing your own life without stealing from mine, then we can have a conversation about what kind of relationship is possible between us. And if I can't, I looked around the room at my neighbors, my real family, the people who'd stood up for me when my own son had tried to exploit me. Then you'll discover that this community protects its own, and you are no longer one of our own. Daniel and Ashley left without another word. Through the window, I watched them drive away, and I felt something I hadn't expected: sadness. Not for the loss of the relationship, but for the discovery of who Daniel really was when his comfort was threatened. "Eleanor," Martha said, breaking the silence, "are you all right?" I thought about the question. Was I all right? I'd just confronted my only child with evidence of his attempt to steal my life's work. I'd chosen my community over my family. I'd drawn boundaries that might never be crossed again. "I'm better than all right," I said. "I'm free." If you've ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting yourself, share your experience below. Sometimes the strongest boundaries are the ones that hurt the most to establish what gave you the courage to choose your own well-being. 6 months later, I'm sitting in the same kitchen where this story began. But everything has changed in ways that matter more than the surface details might suggest. The farm is thriving. We had an excellent harvest. Corn yields 20% above county average. Cattle prices strong through the fall market. The financial health that Daniel thought he could access through manipulation has continued to grow through the same careful management that built it in the first place. But the real changes run deeper than profit margins and bank balances, and not all of them feel like victories. Martha Henderson and I have started something we call the Rural Elder Protection Network. It began informally, with conversations about what happened to me. But it's evolved into a systematic approach to preventing financial elder abuse in farming communities. We've learned that my situation wasn't unique. Across Iowa, adult children facing their own financial crises have been targeting elderly parents who own substantial property. The methods vary: reverse mortgages, power of attorney manipulation, conservatorship proceedings, even outright fraud. But the pattern is always the same: financial desperation overcoming family loyalty, with elderly people bearing the cost of their children's poor decisions. Our network does 3 things: education, documentation, and intervention. We educate seniors about the warning signs of financial manipulation. We teach them how to recognize pressure tactics, how to document concerning behavior, and how to build legal protections before they're needed. We help people document evidence when family members begin showing predatory behavior: phone recordings, witness statements, financial transaction records, all the pieces that turn suspicious behavior into legally actionable elder abuse. And when necessary, we intervene. Rural communities are small enough that reputation matters, and family enough that collective action carries weight. When someone targets one of our elderly neighbors, they discover very quickly that they're not dealing with an isolated victim. The network now includes 47 farming families across 3 counties. We've prevented 6 attempted reverse mortgage scams, documented 3 cases of financial power of attorney abuse, and helped for elderly farmers regain control of assets that family members had stolen. But more than the practical results, we've created something that Daniel never understood: the power of community that chooses to protect rather than exploit. As for Daniel himself, he found his own solution to his debt problems. Not the easy solution he'd been planning, but a real one that required him to take responsibility for his own decisions. He sold his house in Des Moines and moved his family to a smaller town 60 miles away. He took a job with a software company instead of trying to rebuild his startup. Ashley went back to work full-time. They're living modestly, paying off debt gradually, and learning to manage their finances within their actual means, rather than the means they wished they had. I learned all of this not from Daniel, but from Ashley's mother, who called me 3 months ago to apologize for her daughter's behavior and to thank me for not pressing criminal charges. Daniel was desperate, she told me. But desperate people have choices about how they handle their desperation. You taught him that some choices have consequences he wasn't prepared to face. I haven't spoken to Daniel since that Saturday afternoon in my dining room. He's sent letters, first angry, then apologetic, most recently just sad. I read them, but I don't respond. Some boundaries, once crossed, can't be uncrossed through words alone. But I have maintained a relationship with my grandchildren, Daniel's 2 teenagers. They visit every few weeks, sometimes staying overnight, learning about farm work and family history. They don't ask about their father, and I don't offer explanations, but they're old enough to understand that actions have consequences, and that love doesn't mean accepting abuse. From them, I've learned that Daniel talks about me differently now. Not as the confused old woman he thought he could manipulate, but as someone who outsmarted him so thoroughly that he's still trying to understand how it happened. I think he expected me to crumble when he applied pressure. He thought elderly women were inherently vulnerable, that isolation made us easy targets, that our love for family would override our instinct for self-preservation. What he didn't understand is that farm women aren't made vulnerable by age, we're made dangerous by experience. 73 years of life had taught me to recognize predators. Whether they're coyotes circling the chicken coop, or children circling the inheritance. He thought my quiet nature meant I wasn't paying attention, but I was paying attention to everything. His financial situation, his growing desperation, his calculated questions, his systematic manipulation. I was just doing it quietly, the way I've learned to do most important things. The most profound lesson from this experience wasn't about financial protection or legal boundaries, though those matter. It was about the difference between being alone and being isolated. Daniel thought I was isolated, a lonely widow managing a big farm without adequate support. What he couldn't see was that I was embedded in a community of people who knew my character, valued my contributions, and were prepared to defend me when I was attacked. That community didn't appear overnight when I needed it. It was built through 50 years of mutual support, shared work, honest dealing, and consistent care for neighbors. It was strengthened every time I helped someone through a difficult harvest. Every time I lent equipment or shared knowledge or simply showed up when showing up mattered. Daniel had isolated himself from that kind of community through years of prioritizing his career over relationships, his ambitions over obligations, his needs over other people's welfare. When his crisis came, he had no one to turn to except the mother he'd taken for granted. And when she refused to solve his problems at the cost of her own security, he discovered that manipulation might work in business relationships, but it fails catastrophically in communities that value character over cleverness. But here's what I didn't expect. Winning doesn't heal the wound of losing your only child to his own greed. 6 months later, I still sometimes reach for the phone to call Daniel about market prices or weather concerns, forgetting that we don't have that relationship anymore. Victory doesn't erase the fact that I lost my only child to his own choices. Some boundaries protect you, but they also isolate you from people you still love despite everything they've done. I've thought a lot about what I would tell other women facing similar situations. Not just elderly women, but any woman dealing with someone who confuses love with compliance, who mistakes kindness for weakness, who believes that need justifies taking. The answer isn't to become harder or less loving. The answer is to become more strategic about how you express love. and clearer about the difference between helping someone and enabling them to harm you. Real love sometimes means letting people face the consequences of their choices instead of rescuing them from discomfort. Real boundaries sometimes mean accepting that people you care about will be angry with you for refusing to sacrifice yourself for their benefit. But most importantly, real strength often looks like quiet preparation rather than loud confrontation. The most powerful thing I did wasn't yelling at Daniel, or calling him names, or trying to hurt him the way he'd tried to hurt me. The most powerful thing I did was pay attention, document everything, and build the support I needed to protect myself when protection became necessary. Yet there are nights when I lie awake wondering if I could have found a different way. If I could have helped Daniel solve his problems without enabling his willingness to exploit me. If there was a path that preserved both my security and our relationship. I don't have answers to those questions. What I have is the knowledge that I chose my own survival over his convenience, my dignity over his desperation, and my community over my family, when family became dangerous. Daniel learned that threatening someone's security doesn't make them vulnerable, it makes them strategic. And there's nothing more dangerous than an intelligent woman who's decided she's not going to be anyone's victim, even when that someone is her own son. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world, comment below with your city and local time, and let me know. Have you ever had to set boundaries that surprised people who thought they knew you? Sometimes the quietest people have the strongest foundations. And sometimes the most devastating response is simply refusing to be what others expect you to be. And if you're facing a situation where someone is trying to convince you that their needs matter more than your boundaries, remember that you don't have to prove your worth by sacrificing your security. The people who truly love you will find solutions that don't require you to lose everything you've worked for. But also remember that protecting yourself sometimes means accepting losses you never wanted to experience. Setting boundaries isn't just about what you gain. It's about what you're willing to give up to maintain your dignity and security. Thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to subscribe to Quiet Fire Stories for more narratives about boundaries, dignity, and the strength that grows in silence. Your voice matters. Your boundaries matter, and your security matters more than anyone else's convenience. Sometimes the most powerful word in any language is no. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say it clearly, kindly, and completely without negotiation. Because in the end, we teach people how to treat us. And I decided to teach my son that his mother was not someone who could be exploited, manipulated, or discarded when she became inconvenient. That lesson cost him his inheritance, but it might have saved him from becoming the kind of person who would destroy his own mother for money. And it definitely saved me from spending my final years as a victim of someone I'd raised to be better than that. The truth is, I still hope that someday Daniel will understand what he tried to do to me, and why I couldn't allow it. Not because I want an apology, but because I want him to become the kind of man who would never put another elderly person in the position he put me in. Until then, I'll continue to farm this land, protect my community, and live with the complex reality that sometimes saving yourself means losing someone you love. Comment your thoughts below. Subscribe for more stories of quiet strength. And remember, the most dangerous person in any room is often the one everyone underestimates. Because we're not just quiet, we're paying attention. Act 7. Strategic Epilogue 48 minutes and 0 seconds to 54 minutes and 0 seconds 6 months later. I'm sitting in the same kitchen where this story began, but everything has changed in ways that matter more than the surface details might suggest. The farm is thriving. We had an excellent harvest. Corn yields 20% above county average. Cattle prices strong through the fall market. The financial health that Daniel thought he could access through manipulation has continued to grow through the same careful management that built it in the first place. But the real changes run deeper than profit margins and bank balances. Martha Henderson and I have started something we call the Rural Elder Protection Network. It began informally, with conversations about what happened to me, but it's evolved into a systematic approach to preventing financial elder abuse in farming communities. We've learned that my situation wasn't unique. Across Iowa, adult children facing their own financial crises have been targeting elderly parents who own substantial property. The methods vary: reverse mortgages, power of attorney manipulation, conservatorship proceedings, even outright fraud. But the pattern is always the same: financial desperation overcoming family loyalty, with elderly people bearing the cost of their children's poor decisions. Our network does three things: education, documentation, and intervention. We educate seniors about the warning signs of financial manipulation. We teach them how to recognize pressure tactics, how to document concerning behavior, and how to build legal protections before they're needed. We help people document evidence when family members begin showing predatory behavior. Phone recordings, witness statements, financial transaction records, all the pieces that turn suspicious behavior into legally actionable elder abuse. And when necessary, we intervene. Rural communities are small enough that reputation matters, and family enough that collective action carries weight. When someone targets one of our elderly neighbors, they discover very quickly that they're not dealing with an isolated victim. The network now includes 47 farming families across 3 counties. We've prevented 6 attempted reverse mortgage scams, documented 3 cases of financial power of attorney abuse, and helped for elderly farmers regain control of assets that family members had stolen. But more than the practical results, we've created something that Daniel never understood: the power of community that chooses to protect rather than exploit. As for Daniel himself, he found his own solution to his debt problems. Not the easy solution he'd been planning, but a real one that required him to take responsibility for his own decisions. He sold his house in Des Moines and moved his family to a smaller town 60 miles away. He took a job with a software company instead of trying to rebuild his startup. Ashley went back to work full-time. They're living modestly, paying off debt gradually, and learning to manage their finances within their actual means, rather than the means they wished they had. I learned all of this not from Daniel, but from Ashley's mother, who called me 3 months ago to apologize for her daughter's behavior and to thank me for not pressing criminal charges. Daniel was desperate, she told me. But desperate people have choices about how they handle their desperation. You taught him that some choices have consequences he wasn't prepared to face. I haven't spoken to Daniel since that Saturday afternoon in my dining room. He's sent letters, first angry, then apologetic, most recently just sad. I read them, but I don't respond. Some boundaries, once crossed, can't be uncrossed through words alone. But I have maintained a relationship with my grandchildren, Daniel's 2 teenagers. They visit every few weeks, sometimes staying overnight, learning about farm work and family history. They don't ask about their father, and I don't offer explanations, but they're old enough to understand that actions have consequences, and that love doesn't mean accepting abuse. From them, I've learned that Daniel talks about me differently now. Not as the confused old woman he thought he could manipulate, but as someone who outsmarted him so thoroughly that he's still trying to understand how it happened. I think he expected me to crumble when he applied pressure. He thought elderly women were inherently vulnerable, that isolation made us easy targets, that our love for family would override our instinct for self-preservation. What he didn't understand is that farm women aren't made vulnerable by age, we're made dangerous by experience. 73 years of life had taught me to recognize predators, whether they're coyotes circling the chicken coop or children circling the inheritance. He thought my quiet nature meant I wasn't paying attention, but I was paying attention to everything. His financial situation, his growing desperation, his calculated questions, his systematic manipulation. I was just doing it quietly, the way I've learned to do most important things. The most profound lesson from this experience wasn't about financial protection or legal boundaries, though those matter. It was about the difference between being alone and being isolated. Daniel thought I was isolated, a lonely widow managing a big farm without adequate support. What he couldn't see was that I was embedded in a community of people who knew my character, valued my contributions, and were prepared to defend me when I was attacked. That community didn't appear overnight when I needed it. It was built through 50 years of mutual support, shared work, honest dealing, and consistent care for neighbors. It was strengthened every time I helped someone through a difficult harvest, every time I lent equipment or shared knowledge or simply showed up when showing up mattered. Daniel had isolated himself from that kind of community through years of prioritizing his career over relationships, his ambitions over obligations, his needs over other people's welfare. When his crisis came, he had no one to turn to except the mother he'd taken for granted. And when she refused to solve his problems at the cost of her own security, he discovered that manipulation might work in business relationships, but it fails catastrophically in communities that value character over cleverness. I've thought a lot about what I would tell other women facing similar situations. Not just elderly women, but any woman dealing with someone who confuses love with compliance, who mistakes kindness for weakness, who believes that need justifies taking. The answer isn't to become harder or less loving. The answer is to become more strategic about how you express love, and clearer about the difference between helping someone and enabling them to harm you. Real love sometimes means letting people face the consequences of their choices instead of rescuing them from discomfort. Real boundaries sometimes mean accepting that people you care about will be angry with you for refusing to sacrifice yourself for their benefit. But most importantly, real strength often looks like quiet preparation rather than loud confrontation. The most powerful thing I did wasn't yelling at Daniel or calling him names or trying to hurt him the way he'd tried to hurt me. The most powerful thing I did was pay attention, document everything, and build the support I needed to protect myself when protection became necessary. Daniel learned that threatening someone's security doesn't make them vulnerable, makes them strategic. And there's nothing more dangerous than an intelligent woman who's decided she's not going to be anyone's victim. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world, comment below with your city and local time, and let me know. Have you ever had to set boundaries that surprised people who thought they knew you? Sometimes the quietest people have the strongest foundations. And sometimes the most devastating response is simply refusing to be what others expect you to be. And if you're facing a situation where someone is trying to convince you that their needs matter more than your boundaries, remember that you don't have to prove your worth by sacrificing your security. The people who truly love you will find solutions that don't require you to lose everything you've worked for. Thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to subscribe to Quiet Fire Stories for more narratives about boundaries, dignity, and the strength that grows in silence. Your voice matters, your boundaries matter, and your security matters more than anyone else's convenience. Sometimes the most powerful word in any language is no. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say it clearly, kindly, and completely, without negotiation. Because in the end, we teach people how to treat us. And I decided to teach my son that his mother was not someone who could be exploited, manipulated, or discarded when she became inconvenient. That lesson cost him his inheritance. But it might have saved him from becoming the kind of person who would destroy his own mother for money. And it definitely saved me from spending my final years as a victim of someone I'd raised to be better than that. Comment your thoughts below. Subscribe for more stories of quiet strength. And remember, the most dangerous person in any room is often the one everyone underestimates. Because we're not just quiet,